Benedict Cross stood in the center of the polished marble floor, framed by glass walls and gleaming chandeliers, but all the grandeur around him seemed dim compared to the beast at his side. The dog, if one could still call it that, was a thing of scar tissue and muscle, black and silver fur marred by old burns and jagged remnants of battles it never chose. Its name was Ghost, and Ghost was more myth than animal, even among those who trafficked in the rare and dangerous. Cross's voice, smooth as lacquer and sharp as a scalpel, sliced through the murmurs of the high society crowd. $1 million, he announced, pausing with theatrical precision. To anyone in this room who can sit next to Ghost for 5 minutes, without restraint. No leash. No muzzle. Just you and him, side by side. A rustle of discomfort swept through the hall. Some laughed, nervously. Others averted their gaze. Ghost growled low, not a threat, but a promise. His eyes, pale and unblinking, scanned the room with something beyond wariness. It was as if he could see through the designer clothes and diamond bracelets into the soft centers of the men and women pretending they were not afraid. Cross smiled, teeth white against the deep tone of his suit. Of course, those of you who know Ghost's history will understand why this is not merely a wager. It is a question of dominance, of trust, of what remains of instinct once it's been refined. He didn't need to say more. The room already knew the rumors. That Ghost had been bred in secret, trained in pain, and broken beyond repair by a program too brutal for any government to claim. They'd heard about the soldiers he'd turned on, about the handler he had nearly killed. Ghost was no longer property. He was liability wrapped in fur and silence. Still, a few guests stepped forward. A young man in a velvet tuxedo tried first, all bravado and slicked-back charm. He didn't last 10 seconds. Ghost lunged, not to attack, but enough to send the boy stumbling backward into a table of champagne flutes. Shards flew. Laughter followed, uneasy and sharp. Others tried, more cautiously. A retired general, a dog psychologist from Berlin. One after another, they approached and were repelled by something primal in Ghost's stare. It wasn't just aggression, it was grief, ancient and unresolved, like the residue of a betrayal he couldn't forget. In the corner of the hall, unnoticed by most, a small girl stood with her fingers pressed tightly over her ears. She was 12, slight, with unruly auburn hair and a jacket 2 sizes too big. Her name was Willow Hayes, though no one asked. Her eyes were locked on Ghost, not with fear, but with recognition. As if she understood something the others could not name. The challenge continued, but no one came close. Cross began to grow smug, basking in the spectacle he had orchestrated. For him, Ghost was a symbol of control wrested from chaos, of violence made obedient. That no one could approach the dog was, in Cross's mind, a reaffirmation of his own power. But Ghost did not seem victorious. He trembled slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if each failed attempt scratched at something raw inside him. His body was still, but his soul paced behind his eyes, pacing, waiting for something that never came. Then Willow moved. She did not ask permission, did not make an announcement. She simply slipped through the crowd while Cross was distracted, her gaze fixed not on the man, but on the animal beside him. In her hand, she held something small and metallic, a harmonica, old and dented, worn smooth along the edges from years of use. No one noticed her until it was too late. She knelt, slowly, a few feet from Ghost. Her movements were soft, almost dreamlike, as if she were stepping into a memory. Then she raised the harmonica to her lips and began to play. The sound was fragile. Not technically perfect, not showy. Just a gentle, looping melody that rose and fell like breath. Like sorrow shaped into song. Ghost turned toward her. Not sharply, no growl, no snarl, but with something resembling stillness. Recognition. He blinked. Once. Twice. Then, slowly, as if testing the weight of the moment, he took a single step toward her. And sat. The room fell silent. Cross's mouth opened, then closed, the million-dollar challenge dying on his tongue. Someone fumbled a phone. Others whispered. But no one moved. Because Ghost, the monster, the myth, the million-dollar threat, had just laid his body down beside a 12-year-old girl with a harmonica and a silent, aching gaze. And he did not move for a long, long time. They didn't know where she came from. The guards hadn't seen her arrive, and her name wasn't on the guest list. No chauffeur waited for her outside. No whispered legacy followed her footsteps through the marble halls. She was simply there, like a ghost the moment before a dream ends, sitting beside the most dangerous creature in the room as though she'd always belonged there. Willow didn't speak when the crowd encircled her. She didn't even look up when the murmurs turned into demands. Cross's voice, clipped and trembling beneath its usual polish, was the first to break the stunned silence. "Who is this child?" No one answered. Not immediately. And in that delay, 1,000 things became clear. Ghost's posture was unlike anything they'd seen before. He was still, yes, but not in submission. There was a gentleness in the way his head leaned slightly toward her, the weight of his scarred body carefully positioned, as if not to disturb the girl's space. He didn't pant or growl or blink with the constant suspicion he held for others. He simply rested. Willow's fingers stayed loosely curled around the harmonica, the echo of her song still hanging in the air like a fading memory. She didn't need to touch Ghost. Her presence was touch enough. Someone, one of the security staff, stepped forward to remove her. That was when Ghost stood. The growl that followed was unlike the earlier warnings. This was different. It was not threat but certainty. It told them, in a language older than words, that if they laid a finger on the girl, he would become the thing they feared again. The man froze. Cross hesitated. His mind was moving, but not fast enough. For all his brilliance, all his calculated cruelty, this was a variable he hadn't anticipated. The girl hadn't just survived Ghost, she had undone him, calmed him. That meant something. And Cross hated variables. Still, he forced a smile, cold and brittle as ice on glass. "Young lady," he said slowly, his voice taking on a tone usually reserved for children in interrogation rooms. "Why are you here?" Willow looked up for the first time. Her eyes were not the wide, timid kind people expected from children. They were steady, tired. She looked at Cross as if she'd seen men like him before, and they had disappointed her every time. "I came for him," she said. A laugh escaped from one of the guests. Nervous. Disbelieving. "That's not a pet," someone whispered. Willow's gaze didn't waver. "He's not a pet," she agreed softly. "He's someone who got hurt." That stopped the room. A pause, longer this time. The kind of silence that makes people listen even when they don't want to. Cross stepped forward. "Ghost doesn't belong to you." "No," she replied. "He doesn't belong to anyone." There was no rebellion in her tone. No heat. Just the clarity of someone who had lived through enough lies to recognize when one was being dressed as a truth. She reached into her oversized jacket then, not with any rush, but with the calm of ritual, and pulled out a file. Thin. Weathered. She extended it to Cross. He took it hesitantly. Opened it. Inside were photographs, grainy, time-stamped, military-stamped. Ghost younger. Fewer scars. And beside him, always, a man whose face had been burned into classified records and erased from every known story. The handler who trained Ghost. The one Ghost had nearly killed. The one who had a daughter. Cross's hands stiffened around the paper. The girl's name was at the top. Willow Hayes. Born at the edge of a war that wasn't hers. Raised on the perimeter of blood and discipline. Her father had vanished in a failed extraction, presumed dead. No next of kin. No funeral. No closure. Until now. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Cross read enough. Ghost had not attacked his handler. He had tried to protect him, tried and failed. The trauma of that moment, twisted through official reports and repackaged as aggression, had turned Ghost into a weapon for sale. But weapons don't mourn. And Ghost did. Willow leaned closer to him, resting her cheek just near his shoulder. Ghost shifted, almost imperceptibly, to shield her from the light, from the room, from the world. "You can't keep him," Cross said finally. "He's too valuable." Willow looked up again.
"To you."
Her words held no malice. "Just wait." Then, for the first time, something fragile flickered across Cross's face.
Doubt.
A crack in the mask. Because deep down, he understood what the girl had made clear. This was not a matter of ownership anymore. It was a matter of recognition. Ghost had chosen. And the world had seen it. They tried to separate them, of course. That night, when the guests had been ushered out and the auction abruptly cancelled, Cross gave a silent nod to his security team. No one questioned it. Ghost had been sedated before, violently, efficiently, clinically. The girl would be removed. The asset would be secured. But it didn't happen that way. Because the moment one of the handlers stepped forward with a syringe, Ghost's body tensed. Not violently, not yet, but with a stillness so loaded it felt like thunder behind a glass wall. Willow didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She did something that no one expected. She sat cross-legged on the floor, pulled the harmonica from her jacket pocket, and began to play. The notes were uneven at first, wavering like a memory trying to find its shape. Not a song of triumph. Not of joy. Something else. Something older. It was a tune born in between breaths, one she'd heard before language had names, one her father used to play when war thundered outside the walls and silence inside the house became unbearable. A lullaby not meant to soothe, but to say, "I am still here. You are not alone." And Ghost listened. He didn't lower his body as much as dissolve into the sound. His ears twitched with each shift in pitch, and his breathing slowed. There was no command in the notes, no manipulation. Just presence. And in return, he gave her his. The guards looked to Cross. He didn't move.
Couldn't.
What was unfolding before him didn't fit inside the sharp lines of control and strategy he had mastered. It wasn't science. It wasn't obedience. It was recognition. Something forged in silence and scars, and a song shared between two beings who didn't need words to understand each other's pain. For the next several days, she stayed. Cross didn't formally agree. He didn't need to. Willow made no demands. She simply existed in the same space as Ghost, quietly, deliberately, like someone who understood how to survive by not drawing too much attention. She sat near the reinforced glass enclosure during meals, read from an old paperback with pages missing, or just stared into nothing while her fingers absently moved over the harmonica. Sometimes she played. Sometimes she didn't. But Ghost always responded. He stopped pacing. Stopped growling at the staff. The violent episodes ceased entirely. There were moments, fleeting, but unmistakable, when he would rest his head against the thick wall of glass, and she would mirror the gesture with her palm. They were not moments of drama. They were quiet, earnest, intimate. The doctors were baffled. The behavioral analysts drafted report after report, each trying to explain it. Attachment theory, trauma bonding, imprinting. But none of them captured what was actually happening. None of them had been there the night Ghost bared his teeth to protect her before she even asked him to. It was during one of the late hours, when most of the compound had emptied and the fluorescent lights buzzed like tired machines, that Cross finally approached her again. No guards. No clipboard. Just a man unraveling the logic he'd built his empire upon. "She's broken him," one of his advisors had said earlier. But as he watched the two of them, Willow half asleep against the wall, Ghost curled near her like a fallen statue breathing dreams, he understood the truth. She hadn't broken him. She had unbroken something in him. "I've never seen him this calm," Cross said, his voice low. Willow didn't answer right away. Then, "It's not calm. It's safe." That word hung in the air like incense. Cross hated how much it rang true. He studied the girl. "Music," he murmured. "That's all it took?" Willow's eyes didn't move from Ghost. "It wasn't the music." He frowned. "Then what?" She finally looked at him. "It was listening." And in that simple answer was the whole truth, the thing none of them had ever done. They had observed Ghost. Measured him. Tamed, drugged, punished, analyzed. But they had never listened. Not to the way his silence had weight. not to the rhythms in his body language, not to the grief in his eyes when he looked at something that reminded him of a life lost to war. But she did. She listened. Through music, through quiet, through presence. And somehow he had listened back. The strange thing about real connection is how quietly it begins. Not with declarations, not with sudden shifts, but in the unnoticed rituals that slowly settle into the fabric of daily life. Between Willow and Ghost, it began with a single change. He started waiting for her. In the mornings, before the guards even unlocked the corridor door, he would be at the edge of his enclosure, ears alert, unmoving, gaze fixed on the entrance, not with suspicion, but with expectation. And when she arrived, sleep still clinging to her like a fragile second skin, something in him softened. He never smiled. His face didn't know how to arrange itself into that kind of expression anymore. But she didn't need it. His stillness around her said everything. Willow, too, began to shift. Her silences grew less brittle. Her movements, once hesitant, now carried a quiet certainty. She started bringing things. A sketchbook filled with jagged charcoal lines, a threadbare scarf that smelled of old wood smoke and lavender, a metal flask with tea so bitter it made her eyes water, but somehow comforted her. She'd sit cross-legged in the hallway, just outside the reinforced glass, while Ghost lay on the other side, his body curved in a protective arc as if she were inside the cage with him. Neither spoke. Neither had to. Their bond grew not in words but in proximity. In trust built one breath at a time. Ghost began mimicking her routines, eating when she did, resting when her head dipped forward in a brief nap. Once, when she began playing a soft, slow tune on the harmonica, he stood completely still, then mirrored the rise and fall of her breathing, like they were playing a duet without melody. The staff took notice. The cameras recorded everything. Analysts debated whether this was evidence of developing empathy or just a new behavioral pattern. But what they didn't understand, what the reports could never quantify, was the gravity of those moments. Ghost was not obeying. He was connecting. For the first time in years, the creature they had designed to be unfeeling, unthinking, purely reactive, was choosing to engage with something beyond command or control. With someone. Cross watched it all, with a growing unease. The situation was slipping beyond his grasp, but not chaotically. It was worse than that. It was transforming, quietly, methodically, outside the boundaries he had set. Willow was not training Ghost. She was reaching him. And Ghost, in his own way, was reaching back. What haunted Cross more than anything was the realization that Ghost had never truly been unreachable. They had simply never offered him anything worth reaching for. One night, Willow fell asleep against the glass. Her head slumped to the side, her breath fogging a small circle on the cold surface. On the other side, Ghost shifted forward, so carefully, so deliberately, and laid his enormous, scarred hand against that same spot. Not a clawed threat, not a display, just presence. When Willow stirred and blinked up at him, her first instinct was not fear. It was calm. Her hand moved to meet his, fingers spreading until only a layer of reinforced glass separated skin from skin. In that moment, something wordless passed between them. Not affection, exactly. It was too early for that. And not recognition in the traditional sense. It was acceptance. Two broken things, no longer seeing themselves as separate. From that day forward, everything changed. Ghost began responding only to Willow's voice. When she spoke, gently and slowly, he moved without resistance. His aggression, once erratic and unstoppable, vanished entirely when she was near. And Willow, too, began to speak more. Not in long sentences, but in fragments that carried weight. Memories. Observations. The kinds of things one only shares with someone who will never interrupt. "You remind me of the sound after a storm," she whispered once. Ghost didn't understand the words. Not exactly. But he leaned closer. And that was enough. Their bond was not something forged in a single act. It was shaped over days and nights and the space in between, grown not from need, but from the rare and sacred realization that two existences, no matter how damaged, could still find meaning in each other's presence. And in that slow, quiet becoming, a new truth began to take shape. They were no longer subject and observer, not handler and experiment, not protector and protected. They were each other's witness. And the world beyond the cage, beyond the lab, beyond the auction, beyond Cross, was beginning to lose its grip on them both. It doesn't arrive in great declarations or sudden reversals. It begins in the quiet moments, when a voice softens instead of sharpens, when a body once coiled in instinctive defense starts to rest without fear. For Ghost, healing came not as an event, but as a slow erosion of the violence that had once been etched into his very bones. And at the center of it was Willow. By now, the facility had changed. Or rather, Ghost's corner of it had. The cold sterility of the enclosure remained, but the atmosphere within had shifted. Ghost no longer paced the walls or clawed at the air. He sat, still and grounded, watching Willow with a kind of reverence that couldn't be manufactured. She no longer brought tools, only presence. And it was that presence, patient, unwavering, that began to knit his frayed mind back together. He followed her voice like a thread through darkness. When she read aloud, he didn't understand every word, but the cadence calmed him. When she hummed a melody, he breathed to its rhythm. He began sleeping, truly sleeping, not the half-conscious drifting of trauma, but deep, silent rest. The scars on his body remained, but the twitch in his jaw eased. The violence in his eyes receded. He no longer looked like something waiting to be triggered. He looked like someone remembering what it meant not to be afraid. The staff called it a breakthrough. Cross called it a liability. But Willow never called it anything. To her, Ghost was never a result. He was a person wounded, yes, but whole enough to hold on to. And perhaps most painfully of all, he began to believe that, too, it was Bramble who noticed the difference first. She had always watched from the shadows. Her cage, a little deeper in the east wing, was colder, smaller. She didn't make noise. She barely moved. Unlike Ghost, Bramble had not been made to destroy. She had been made to endure. The isolation, the injections, the silence, it hadn't broken her, exactly. But it had taught her how to disappear while staying in plain sight. When Ghost began sitting by the glass without tension, when he began tracing shapes into the floor with his fingers like a child remembering how to play, Bramble stirred. Just slightly. The motion was enough. Willow noticed. She didn't approach immediately. Healing wasn't something you imposed. It had to be offered, and then if the wound was ready, it would be accepted. So she lingered nearby. Quietly.
Casually.
She left small things outside Bramble's enclosure. Folded paper cranes, a comb with a strand of her own red hair still caught in it, a book whose cover had been worn smooth. She never said why. She never looked back to see if they were taken. But they were. Bramble didn't trust easily. She had once bitten a handler's finger clean off and didn't blink when they punished her for it. She had learned early that kindness was often a trap, and silence was safer than hope. But something about Willow's gaze, calm, exhausted, unafraid, told her this wasn't a trick. It was something stranger. Something dangerous, in the most unexpected way. It was real. The first time Willow sat outside Bramble's cell, the girl didn't acknowledge her. But Ghost was there too, on the opposite side, his massive form folded like a watchful sentinel.
He didn't speak.
He didn't move. But his presence gave Bramble a kind of strange safety, as if to say, she's real. I've survived her softness. Willow began speaking. Not with questions. Not with soothing lies. Just fragments. Pieces of her own past that she offered like fragile artifacts. Memories of running through forests, of music lessons with hands that trembled from rage she never understood. Of being told her sensitivity made her weak. Of crying once and being told not to do it again. She never said she understood Bramble, but she showed her that understanding wasn't a requirement for compassion. Days passed, then weeks, and then one night, after Willow read a line from a worn book, "Even a wolf lies down when the night is quiet enough," Bramble looked up. Her lips parted. Her voice, raspy from disuse, barely reached across the room. "What's it like outside?" Willow didn't answer right away. She didn't rush to fill the space. When she did speak, it wasn't with hope, but with honesty.
Loud. Messy.
But there's sky.
And wind.
And the kind of silence that doesn't hurt. It wasn't a promise. It was an invitation. Bramble didn't respond. But the next day, she sat closer to the glass. And when Willow reached into her satchel and pulled out the harmonica again, Bramble didn't flinch. She listened. Healing, it turned out, was contagious. What Willow gave Ghost, she passed to Bramble, not as a cure, but as a kind of defiant tenderness. Proof that what had been done to them didn't have to be the end of their stories. That they were not just the product of cages and syringes and experiments. They were people, in pieces perhaps, but still capable of becoming whole again. And in the quiet between them all, Willow, Ghost, and now Bramble, a strange kind of family began to form. Not born, not bound by blood, but forged in survival, in choice, in love, of the most dangerous kind. The kind that dares to believe the broken can still bloom. Benedict Cross was not a man who understood the concept of failure, not truly. He had built his career on calculated cruelty, cloaked in the language of progress. Efficiency, utility, sacrifice. These were the shields he wore while dismantling lives. So when the narrative began to fracture, when his authority was quietly challenged by nothing more than a woman with an instrument and a heart too soft for this place, it did not humble him. It enraged him. At first he watched, silent, calculating. Willow's interactions with Ghost had, to his eyes, begun as harmless diversions. A novelty, a test he was confident would fail and prove his point. But Ghost hadn't broken her. Quite the opposite. The creature had changed. Softened, yes, but more than that, stabilized. He responded to her voice, followed simple cues. The erratic, volatile data sets had become eerily consistent. The scientists whispered the word rehabilitation. Some even dared say sentience. Cross hated that word. Not because he doubted it, but because once you acknowledged sentience, you invited morality into the conversation. And morality had no place in his domain. The real fracture came with Bramble. Cross had almost forgotten about her. A minor asset, emotionally unstable and deemed non-cooperative. She was a placeholder in his roster. But now she, too, was changing. Eating regularly. Responding. Communicating. He read the daily logs with a clenched jaw. Every line was another strike against his control. Every documented success of Willow's presence eroded the foundation of his authority. And authority, to Cross, was identity. He tried subtle first. Reducing Willow's access. Increasing oversight. Random wellness evaluations scheduled at inconvenient hours. Passive-aggressive memos, and signed but clearly authored by his hand. But the more he tightened the noose, the more the narrative slipped from his grasp. Worse, people were beginning to see her. Not just as a handler, not even as a healer, but as a threat, the kind that exposes the lies everyone's grown too comfortable living under.
There was talk now.
From donors, from directors, from board executives who had never stepped foot near the cages, but had suddenly taken an interest in the Willow Protocol. She had become an uninvited symbol of hope. Hope was dangerous. It made people imagine alternatives. So Cross shifted. If he could not undo the results, he would rot their foundation. He began whispering things into the right ears. That she had become emotionally compromised. That her relationship with the subjects blurred ethical lines. That the changes in Ghost were not rehabilitation, but a calculated manipulation by a predator who had learned how to mimic docility. He used the word Stockholm with a cruel gleam. He spoke of security risks, of blurred identities. He doctored a report, nothing overtly false, just carefully reframed data. Subject G, 7 exhibits increased attachment to handler, potentially obsessive. Subject B, 2 mimics handler's emotional states, suggesting instability, not growth. He knew how to use the language of science to seed doubt without triggering scrutiny. But the real dagger came with what he did next. He leaked footage. Carefully selected clips from surveillance. Willow sitting too close. Ghost brushing his hand against hers. Bramble pressing her palm to the glass as Willow leaned forward. In isolation, they could be seen as inappropriate. He framed them as unprofessional, as manipulative. A handler overstepping her role, endangering the sanctity of the research. He sent it anonymously to the board. The fallout was slow, quiet, and surgical. Meetings were held without her. A review panel was formed. The questions she wasn't prepared to answer were asked in rooms she wasn't invited into. One of the internal auditors, a man she'd never met, began shadowing her every move. Willow felt it long before they told her. The gaze in the hallway lingered longer. The smiles tightened. The silence around Cross, once mildly antagonistic, turned icy. And she knew. He was rewriting the story. This wasn't about truth. It was about perception. And in places like this, where the line between subject and asset blurred daily, perception was law. But what Cross didn't understand, what he would never understand, was that Willow had been broken before. Long before she ever stepped into this place. She knew how to survive in silence. She had once lived in the gaps between other people's words, navigating invisible hostility like a maze. She had learned not to scream when the walls closed in, but to listen carefully, to find the flaw in the design and wait for the moment it cracked. She didn't respond publicly. She didn't defend herself in desperation. She focused on Ghost, on Bramble, on the tiny flickers of progress that no surveillance camera could contextualize. Cross mistook her silence for submission. But healing had taught her something far more dangerous than defiance. It had taught her patience. And while Cross poisoned the air above, Willow planted roots below. In the ones who had once been experiments. In the ones he had deemed irredeemable. In lives he had forgotten how to see. And those lives were no longer his to control. A good day. A lucky moment. A brief smile from someone who usually doesn't. For a long time, even Willow herself wasn't certain what she was building. She only knew it was fragile. That it could vanish in a moment if handled too roughly, like a melody played on an instrument with broken strings. So she moved gently, like a hand tracing cracks in porcelain, not to hide them, but to understand them. Ghost had stopped shaking at her touch. Bramble no longer flinched when the lights flickered. These were not breakthroughs in the clinical sense. They were not easy to chart on a progress report. But something was happening. Something real. Not a phenomenon. Not a quirk of temporary improvement. A shift. Ghost began speaking. Not often and never when asked. But sometimes in the silence between her questions, he would offer a phrase. A memory. An unfinished sentence like a thread pulled from a deeper tangle. Once, unprompted, he whispered, "Do you know what pine trees smell like?" And then looked away, as if ashamed of what it had cost to remember. Bramble started humming. At first, Willow thought it was mimicry. The girl had always been observant, watching faces, copying expressions like masks. But this was different. Bramble began humming when Willow wasn't even present. Soft, wandering melodies that echoed through the hallways in the early mornings before the staff arrived. Melodies Willow didn't recognize. Ones that hadn't come from her violin. They weren't just reacting to her anymore. They were responding to something within themselves. The transformation was slow, like snow melting underground. But it was undeniable. The caretakers who once watched the enclosures like guards began to pause. They leaned in. They asked Willow questions not out of protocol, but out of genuine curiosity. Did he always look at people like that? Has she ever smiled before? The lab techs lingered longer after shifts. Some even started requesting to sit in on her sessions, not to report her but to learn. Cross noticed, of course. His bitterness turned quiet, sharper. He didn't try to sabotage again so directly. Instead, he tried to drown her in structure. New guidelines. Additional evaluations. Useless, spirit-crushing paperwork designed to make her too tired to care. But the more he pushed, the more others began pushing back, not loudly, but in their own quiet refusals. A nurse rerouted a form she wasn't supposed to. A junior researcher forgot to log an observation that would have added to Cross's case. Even the janitor left her handwritten notes folded in the supply closet, small words of encouragement, as if reminding her that what she was doing mattered. And maybe that was the moment it stopped being about survival. Maybe that was the moment it became something more. Willow started keeping a journal, not for the scientists, not for the review panels, but for herself. Not just data, but reflections. Things Ghost said that echoed long after he'd fallen silent. Bramble's art, those strange, frantic chalk drawings that had begun to look like scenes instead of storms. She wrote about the way they stood a little closer to the glass now. The way Ghost once reached up to mimic the motion of her bow hand, as if trying to play some invisible instrument between them. She didn't call it therapy. She didn't dare call it healing. She just called it connection. And in a place built to isolate, to divide subject from handler, mind from body, humanity from function, that was the most radical act of all. The other subjects began to shift too. Slowly. The ones who were once volatile became quieter when she passed. Some followed her with their eyes. A few even began requesting music. They didn't know her name, but they knew her presence. They felt the tremor in the air she carried, like something ancient had remembered how to breathe through her. And Willow, she felt it too. In her sleep, she no longer dreamed of cages. She dreamed of forests, of wind through leaves, of a song she hadn't written yet but knew by heart. She began wearing her necklace again, the one her brother gave her before the silence swallowed him whole. She didn't hide it anymore. One evening, long after lights out, Ghost pressed his hand to the glass and simply said, "You're real." She wanted to cry at that, not because it was poetic, but because for years she had forgotten it too. Willow was no longer just part of the story. She had become the change itself, not the spark, the fire. And deep in the infrastructure of the facility, in its rhythms, its culture, its carefully curated cruelty, something began to unravel. Quietly, irrevocably, not because it had been attacked, but because someone had dared to feel. And in the cold machinery of indifference, feeling was the first revolution. For a long time, Willow never spoke about her mother. Not out of spite, not even because the memories were too painful, but because silence had become the only language left between them. Her mother had passed when Willow was still a teenager, before the war, before the syndicate, before the walls of the facility closed around her. Yet her absence had never left. It clung to Willow in the small rituals, the way she brewed her tea, the way she folded her clothes, the way she touched the strings of her violin like they were bones made of memory. Her mother had been a musician too, not a performer, but a composer. Quiet, underrated, someone who never sought the stage, but whose music was always playing in the background of Willow's life. Growing up, Willow had thought of her as too soft for the world, too gentle to leave a mark. Only later did she understand. Some women don't mark the world by conquering it. They change it by refusing to mirror its cruelty. Now, in the heart of the facility, beneath the cold hum of halogen lights and the surveillance that never blinked, that legacy stirred like an echo in Willow's chest. She had found one of her mother's old scores while sorting through a box of belongings the state had almost incinerated. It was handwritten, imperfect. There were corrections scratched into the margins and coffee stains on the corners. But when Willow ran her fingers across the ink, she could almost hear the melody again. Not with her ears, with her body, with the part of her that remembered being held.
She didn't cry,
But she did play it.
once.
Just once. At night, when the guards had changed shifts and the hallway monitors had that 2-minute lag. She played it low, not on her concert violin, but on the battered one the subjects had come to know. The instrument she had brought for them, not for herself. Ghost woke up and listened. Bramble crept closer. One of the guards, stationed 2 floors up, reported a dream he couldn't explain, one where someone was singing his name without a voice. Willow didn't know why she had played it. Not until days later, when she returned to her quarters and found a single page tucked into her journal. A drawing. A simple one. Crude, but unmistakable. It was Bramble's work, a child's scrawl of a woman and a girl. One held a violin, the other a book of music. They were sitting under a tree. There was no color, but the expressions were unmistakable.
Peace.
Recognition. Willow stared at it for a long time, not because she was confused, but because the truth finally settled. The song was not for the subjects. It wasn't even for her mother. It was for herself, the self she had abandoned when she stepped into the compound. The self that had always wanted to say, "I remember you," and, more importantly, "I forgive you." Her mother had never known how to protect her. She had tried, of course, tried to teach her tenderness in a world that rewarded armor. But when the world turned, when the machines of power demanded sacrifice, her mother had chosen silence. Not because she didn't love Willow, but because she had thought silence might keep her safe. It hadn't. And yet, somehow, that failure wasn't the end of their story. Willow took the page Bramble had drawn and placed it beneath the strings of her violin, like a talisman. A kind of acceptance. A quiet apology given shape. She began talking to her mother again, not aloud, but in thought, in gesture. Every time she chose kindness over compliance. Every time she played for the sake of beauty, not protocol. Every time she leaned toward the glass and listened instead of diagnosing. She imagined her mother would be proud. But more than that, she imagined her mother would understand. The way women who have suffered long and silently often do, without needing explanation, without needing perfection. Just presence. Just a reaching back. One morning, Ghost asked her, "Did you love someone who couldn't love you back?" She didn't lie. She said, "Yes." And then, after a long pause, she added, "But maybe that's not the full story. Maybe they just didn't know how." Ghost didn't answer. But for the first time he smiled. Not at her. Not as a performance. But to himself. As if something inside him had softened just enough to remember what it meant to grieve gently. Later that week, Willow found a scrap of paper near her violin case. It wasn't a drawing this time. It was a phrase, scrawled in awkward, uneven handwriting. "Thank you for playing her song." There was no signature.
But there didn't need to be.
Sometimes, forgiveness doesn't come in words. It comes in echoes, in legacy, in music, and in the quiet absolution of a daughter who, at last, allowed herself to say goodbye. The day they left the facility, there were no alarms, no dramatic breaches, no blood, no shattered glass or panic-stricken guards. Just silence, strangely soft, like the breath right before a symphony begins. It had taken months, not to plan the escape, though that had been complex, but to be ready for it. The kind of readiness that has nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with what a person believes they deserve. Ghost, for all his brilliance and rage, had never thought he would walk freely under an open sky again. Bramble, who clung to Willow like a tether to something human, could not imagine a world where people smiled without flinching. And even Willow, composed and deliberate, had carried the invisible weight of a promise that once felt more like a sentence than a vow.
But they had all changed. Slowly. Painfully.
In the friction of grief and gentleness. In the small, repeated choices to trust, not because it was safe, but because it was necessary to become whole again. The moment of escape was quiet because it had to be. The facility had begun to crumble, not physically, but ideologically. Benedict Cross's smear campaign had exposed him more than her. The footage he leaked, meant to cast Willow as a manipulative threat, had instead drawn public sympathy. A violinist reaching through glass. A child drawing pictures. A subject smiling, however faintly, for the first time in years. These were not acts of corruption. They were acts of care. Somewhere along the way, the public turned. A few protesters gathered. A retired psychologist gave an interview about Willow's mother, how she had once mentored a generation of trauma researchers with music. A former guard anonymously sent out a recording of Bramble laughing. The syndicate faltered. And that was when Willow made her move, not just for herself, but for them. She didn't take many things when they left. The old violin. The drawing Bramble had made. One of Ghost's journals, the pages now filled with lines that made sense only to him. The rest was memory, held in the way she guided them through the trees beyond the perimeter, breath tight, every shadow a possible betrayal, until the stars opened above them like permission. They didn't speak much in those first few hours. Ghost walked ahead, eyes alert, but slower than he used to be, no longer hunted, but unsure how to walk without the posture of a weapon. Bramble clutched Willow's hand with a kind of reverence, as if afraid that letting go would cause all of it to vanish. And Willow, she kept her gaze forward, but her mind wandered backwards, tracing the long, broken path that had led them here. It wasn't until they reached the old cabin, one she had inherited through a forgotten clause in her mother's will, that they breathed. It wasn't much. A roof. Some wood. A creek that whispered beneath the trees. But to them it was enough. Not because it was safe, but because it wasn't a cell. It didn't demand anything. It simply stood, quiet and open, waiting to be made into something new. They spent the first few weeks like animals rediscovering what it meant to be human. Willow taught Bramble how to plant herbs, how to know when Mitt was thirsty, or how lavender calmed the bees. Ghost chopped wood in silence, carving notches into each log, as if measuring his place in this strange new timeline. He didn't sleep easily. Neither did Willow. But sometimes, in the early hours, he would sit with her by the fire and read aloud, his voice uneven, but real. Present. Bramble painted the walls with pictures of skies she had never seen but imagined in color. Oranges that bled into violets, stars that blinked like secrets, birds that never stopped flying. Willow kept her promise, not the one she had made to the syndicate, or even to her mother, but the one she made silently the first day she met Ghost through the glass. I will see you, even when no one else does. And in turn, something inside her began to heal too. Not all at once, but piece by piece. The way grief loosens its grip when met with gentleness. The way silence becomes sacred when chosen. The way a promise, fulfilled, transforms from burden into bond. One night, under the weight of stars and the smell of wood smoke, Ghost looked at her, not as a subject, not as a savior, but as someone real. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't need to. He said simply, "I didn't think places like this existed." Willow smiled, her voice soft. They don't. Not until we make them. It wasn't a happy ending. Because healing isn't an ending. It's a beginning.
Messy.
Incomplete. Fragile and real. The cabin would need repairs. Their minds would always carry shadows. But here, in this quiet place carved from pain and persistence, they could begin again. Not as symbols, not as survivors, but as people learning how to live. And that, finally, was the promise fulfilled. Not escape. Not vengeance. But a place to heal. Together.